I think of watercolor as a bit of a sociable medium. It likes to spread out, it likes to investigate the paper, it likes to mix around with other bits. So that's something that we can use to our advantage, but it's also something that we've got to bear in mind and manage. So one thing to bear in mind is that the thicker our paint is, the more firmly it'll sit on the paper. If we've got very runny paint, it'll run around a lot, it'll be very dilute, and that can be interesting and cloudy and good for filling in. But when we've got fairly thick paint, that can be good for creating strong, clear lines. So with this wet on dry, we can use that to make the outlines of things, and that's what we're going to practice to begin with. So if you could all get your palettes ready, you should have a palette that looks something like this. And now we're just going to experiment just taking up a medium-sized brush. I'm going to use a number 8 size brush. Anything of this sort of size will do. So there we go. An 8 size brush, but anything of that sort of size should do. And then I'm just going to, first of all, wake it up. I'm going to dip it in my water. Now there's a reason I've asked you to get 2 jars of water. That's because one of these is going to become our dirty water, and the other one is going to be our clean water. And it's a good habit to get into as soon as possible, that whenever we rinse our brush, whenever we want to apply water, we give it a good shake about, first in the dirty water jar, then tap out some of the excess water, and then in our clean water jar. And this is because we want to minimize the amount of paint that gets carried over from one color to the next. So when we're rinsing it in water, we give it a good shake about to wake it up, to get it nice and flexible. We want our brush to be wet, but not dripping wet. So I'm just going to tap it a couple of times on the edge of the jar there, just to make sure that there's water, but it's not dripping off it. And then I'm going to pick a color. And for this, it doesn't matter what color you use. It can be any color you want. I think I'm going to go for this rather lurid sort of pinky red. And we're just going to use a backwards and forwards motion, very, very gentle pressure, just to work the bristles slightly into our pigment, wake it up, and get a bit of paint on our brush. We want to do that quite a bit, just to make sure that we've got a fairly thick paint that's on the end of our brush. And then once we've done that, once we've got the end of our brush loaded, I'm turning it around just to make sure that every bit of the brush gets loaded. We're just going to practice our wet on dry by drawing some small circles. I've got an A4 sheet, but you'll have an A5 sheet. So maybe just the size of a 2p piece or a 5p piece. Just get used to the feel of drawing circles with a brush. And we can see that because the paint is quite concentrated, it's not really spreading out that much. No pressure at all. No pressure at all. Just using the very tip of the brush, turning it as we go, so that paint from every area of the brush hits the paper. I'll do a couple of circles of different sizes. I think I'm going to do 4, just to get a feel for what it's like to draw a line with our brush. I'll just wait a minute, just that we can do those, and then I'm going to rinse my brush off. I'm going to give it a firm shake in my dirty water, get the dirty water a nice shade of pink, and then because we don't want to be splashing pink all over the place, I then rinse it in my clean water. And the clean water doesn't turn pink, so now we've got a brush that's nice and slightly wet, but not full of the wrong paint. And if we're all ready, have we all done that and we've all got our brush nice and clean now?
Yeah.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to do what's called a tonal gradient. And this is where we get a smooth gradient from a large amount of paint through to less paint. We're going to begin by loading our brush. I'm going to choose a different color for this. Let's go for this. Well, we can go for anyone we want. Again, tapping out that brush so it's not too wet. I'm going to go for this blue, I think. Work the brush in and get the same sort of consistency of paint that we did just now. Turning the brush to make sure that it gets fully loaded with that nice thick color. Now we're going to visualize the gradient that we're going to paint. So I think I'd like to have one that's color fading out this way. So we start off by painting just a straight band of color, just like this. Gentle strokes coming off the paper often, no pressure at all. Just dipping the brush a little bit like that wherever we feel like there's not quite enough paint. I'm just going to create a band of color, just like that. Very dark, very solid. And I might make another band of color. Maybe facing a slightly different direction. Maybe I'm going to do one like this. Now, I mentioned earlier that with watercolor, we've got quite a sociable medium that likes to sort of spread out. And sometimes that's a nuisance, but we can really use that to our advantage when we're making a gradient. So if we're all ready, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my brush. I'm just going to dip it in my water, just like this, just once. And then with that wet brush, I'm going to apply it half on and half off that band of color. I'm going to use a very light backwards and forwards motion just to pull a little bit of dilute paint through, just so that we can start to develop a sort of gradient. And you see, of course, we can pull some paint through, but not all of it. And so we're gradually going to develop that movement through to a lighter sort of shade. Maybe we can just sort of push some paint back if we think there's a few blooms that are getting out of the way, because that's the great thing, is that watercolor, it's so flexible, it moves about on the page so willingly when it's wet. We can just push paint around until it's getting the effect that we desire. And I'm going to do something similar with my other bit of paint just here. Just dip that brush in water, and maybe I'm going to have it going this way. So just brush half on, using that wet brush to really pull the color. That's what we're doing. We're pulling the color out from the band and outwards. And gradually, of course, the color lessens and we start to develop our gradient. And then just pushing and pulling that color. If we think, I'd like some color over here, or that color shouldn't be there. Well, it's the work of a moment just to push and pull it around until the color is where we'd like it to be. Very little is permanent when we're working with watercolor. That's the great thing. Even if we're not happy with the way something's gone, we can always wake up the paint again with water and then reshape it and move it around again. So once we've done that, I'm going to want to clean my brush off completely. So I'm going to do that now. We know the drill. And then I'll just wait a moment so that we're happy that we've got that second stage of the gradient. Give it a good old bath, swirling around in the dirty water, get all that pigment out, tap it out, and then give it a slightly gentler bath in my clean water. And then I'm just going to make sure, tap it a couple of times, wet but not dripping, so that I've got a wet brush. And I'll just wait a moment so we're all happy with what I've done so far. Are we all ready to continue?
Yep.
Yes. Okay, so with our wet brush, Again, we're going to lay it half on, half off. And with those same very gentle backwards and forwards motions with that wet brush, we're going to start really waking up that paint and then pulling it again. But it's so much lighter now that we can really make it fade into nothingness, just like that. And there are some odd blooms here, so we can shove them about a bit. And if there's paint that we'd like to rearrange a little, well, we've got the luxury of being able to do that. Until we get a gradient that we rather like. And maybe if I think that there's a little too much of that pale stretch at the left, at the right, then I can just get a wet brush. I can just grab some of that up and just fade it out even more. And then I'm just going to do the same thing for this second gradient over here. Just a matter of grabbing that paint, backwards and forward strokes to really take up the pigment, and then just pull it out, smudge some of those lines, just pull the paint. And then I'm just going to rinse my brush again, get all that blue off it, or whatever color you're using. And I'll just wait a moment as we get ready to do the next thing. So if we're all ready, what we're going to do now is we're going to have a think about different ways we can use this gradient technique, because it's all very well having a straight gradient like this, but the truth is we can make them of more interesting shapes. So we've already painted these circles here, these sort of polo mints, but I think it'd be quite fun to make them into spheres. And to do that, we're going to do a slightly more creative gradient on them. So with my brush that's wet but not dripping wet, I'm going to load up with the same color that I drew this outline with. So it'll be a different color for you, but for me, it's this one here. And I'm going to do exactly the same sort of process that we've just done for the gradient, but I'm going to change the shape a little bit. So I'm going to start off with a nice, fairly thickly loaded band of paint. That looks good to me. And then I'm going to have a think, and I think I'd like some light to be hitting these spheres from over here, which means that the shadow is going to be on the opposite side, light coming from here, so shadow around here. I'm going to do a sort of crescent moon shadow like this. So I'm going to get a band of thick color for the darkest part. I'm just going to paint it in like this. And then I'm going to do something similar for my other little circles as we get ready to haul them into the third dimension and make them pop. A little half moon shadow in the area of the circle that's furthest from the light. And then once I've done that, really we're just doing the same technique that we did before, only instead of pulling color from a straight band of color, we're pulling it from a slightly curved band of color. So dip my brush very carefully once in my water, half on. I'm going to pull the paint, spread it about a bit. Push some of the paint back where I think that would be appropriate. Watercolor, a very sociable medium, very happy to go wherever the brush wants it to. Always happy to explore. And then I'm going to do something similar, again with a wet brush elsewhere. So let's do that here. Let's add a bit more dilute color here. Always making sure that we really go backwards and forwards onto that color that's already down. Because what we don't want to do is just be laying one bar of color over another. We really want to be waking up that color and making sure that it's moving and socializing and circulating with the new color that we're putting on. So once I've done that, I'm going to clean my brush thoroughly. Very vigorous bath in my dirty water jar, and a light swirl in my clean water. Tap out the excess water, and then with a wet brush, it's just a matter of drawing the paint, guiding it, maybe pushing some back where I think that would look nice. And maybe between spheres, I'll just give it a quick rinse to make sure that I'm not carrying paint from one sphere to the next. Working that paint all the way around, shoving it back where that's necessary. Just exploring, just getting that 3D sort of effect. Mine are starting to look like giant red noses or maybe super balls. Maybe you'll have soap bubbles or giant hailstones or huge garden peas or whatever it is that the color you are using is. I'm just going to do the last one like this. And I'll just wait a moment just so that we're all happy, that we can have an explore of that and see how we can use these tonal gradient techniques to pull color around and get a 3D effect. And now once you're finished with that, there's no rush, I'll wait a moment, but I'm going to get ready now. We're going to start thinking about our main drawing for today, which is our flowers. So if you could, once you've finished, take your A5 sheet and put that to one side and get one of your A4 sheets, which I've got here. Get that ready. And I'm going to put a bit of masking tape down in a minute because that's what I like to do. But while I do that, once you've finished, something to do is to have a look at this flower and just to have a think about how we could use what we've just learned, because we've got quite a nice, clear, fairly complicated outline, haven't we? But then we've got all these little gradations. We've got all these different shadowings, all these gradients from dark pink to light pink. And well, we can use what we've learned to make those gradients, to make those areas of dark pigment to lighter pigment. There's all sorts of ways that we can use what we've learned. So while I chuck some tape down, and just once you've finished, just have a think about that. So if everyone's ready, if everyone's got their A4 piece of paper, I'm going to have a look at this. And I think it's important to note one of our main rules of watercolor, that we always want to start with our lighter colors. So we're going to want to start off with the light colors of the petals before we then go to the dark colors inside. And to these things here, are they seed heads? Are they stamens? These bits here. So I think what I'd like to do is to start off with the outline of our flower, and we're going to draw that with the brush using that wet on dry technique that we did to do our circles. So I'm going to have a look at the outline, and I'm going to have a think about how I'm going to map that onto my sheet of A4. I'm going to look particularly for any interestingly shaped petals. And I think that this one here is quite distinctive. It's a sort of, excuse me, it's a sort of S shape that then flicks into this little flange here, isn't it? So I think I might start by doing this line and then working my way around to create an outline. So to do that, very happily, it looks like we've got a picture. Oh, while I'm doing this, Ken, have you been sent a picture by Teresa?
No, I don't know, because I've got you on my tablet. So
okay, well, Teresa should be emailing this to you, but in the meantime, the great thing is that, of course, we're just using this picture as a guide. So if you've got me to look at while I'm drawing this, you should be able to see that I'm following the outline, but of course we don't need to photocopy this. We just want to get our own interpretation. So do let me know though if at any point you'd like me to whiz this onto the screen for a reference point, because I appreciate it must be difficult flying blind like this.
Yeah, one problem with the brush, it doesn't, when I wash it, it still retains a lot of paint on it.
Okay, have you got your 2 jars, yeah?
Yeah.
And we have to be quite vigorous when we wash it. You know, so in my dirty water, I'm really giving it.
Yeah, but I've done it.
Then I tap it, and then in the clean water, you see, the clean water doesn't allow any pigment to remain.
The plain color, you know, brush. The brush is all stained.
Oh yeah, well, so staining will remain. I mean, you can see that my brush has got these stains on it.
All right.
The great thing is, of course, that that if it's stained like that, any pigment that doesn't come off after a thorough washing in our jars is not going to go onto the paper. So the hairs of the brush will get stained like that, but it won't affect our drawing, because I can wave this stained brush onto the white paper, and you can see there's no marks whatsoever. So yes, that's nothing to worry about. Now, if we're all ready, I think this is called Rose in the color guide to your palettes. This pink here looks like a pretty good match for the color of our flower. So with a brush that is wet but not dripping, we're just going to wake that up. Some backwards and forward strokes, working the bristles very gently into our color. We want to get a fairly thick paint. We're going to do the same thing, trying to get a fine line to get a hard outline. Once I've got that paint, I'm going to be using the tip of the brush, no pressure at all, just to very gently draw my outline. So it sort of starts here, doesn't it? And then we get a bulbous sort of curve outwards, using lots of short little strokes. And then we sort of come out like this. And then we sort of flick like that. The line can be a little bit hairy, it can be a little bit messy. That's all okay, because we're going to fill these in. I think it's worth saying now that I think with watercolor, there's really no need to ever do a pencil outline of anything, because it's so easy to draw an outline with the brush. And if worst comes to the worst, and you really do make a mistake that can't be rectified, well then you can just erase it very easily. And if you do and find yourself making a mistake, something that you'd like to rub out, we just get a bit of wet kitchen roll, and we apply a wet brush to the area, and then some wet kitchen roll, we just draw the paint out, and it's as good as a rubber, if not better. Which is why I think we'd just be giving ourselves extra work if we spent time faffing around with a pencil. We can draw perfectly well with a brush. And as I'm doing this, if I feel the paint getting a little bit dilute, I turn my brush around as I go. And what that does is that makes sure that paint from every corner of the brush hits the paper. I should say that this isn't any old flower. This is a flower that was bred and designed by an ancestor of mine. And as such, it's named after him. It's known as a Bernard anemone. And they still grow. I'm from Dorset originally. And at the house where I used to live, they still pop up in the spring. And so I took this photograph of one of those flowers. And as I mentioned earlier, of course, we don't need to worry if we don't get an outline that looks exactly like a copy of the one we've got on our photograph. Because if we wanted a copy, then we'd use a photocopier. But that would be really boring. So you can see that this petal here has got a bit of a life of its own, but that's okay, just as long as it looks like the anemone that we're trying to get a picture of, that's okay. And I'm dipping my brush back in my rather thick paint whenever I feel the outline to be getting a bit pale, or like I'm losing that thickness that lets me get a dark, crisp outline. And again, remember, no pressure at all. No pressure at all, and using the very tip, that's the secret to how we get this fine line. Maybe this petal needs to be a bit bigger. So I'm just going to quickly restate like that. It doesn't matter because this pink paint here, we can wake it up at a later date. And we can turn it into something that's part of the petal's texture. I'm just going to wait just for a couple of minutes now, just so that we're all happy that we've got that outline. And if anyone has any questions, or if I am going too fast or too slow, then please do say. Because of course, if we were in the real world, then I would be able to see how you're all doing and we could all have a look at each other's. But as we're online, I do have to hear from you if there's anything you'd like me to do differently.
Just while you're not seeing mine.
I'm sure that's not the case.
It is.
Give me.
Oh, I'll have to get some masking tape. I see what you mean about that.
It can sometimes be a bit of a problem, can't it? This is fairly
Yeah.
thick paper, but it does, I think it does help a little bit.
Ugh. Oh my God. Oh God. Oh dear.
Everyone all right? Because as I say, it doesn't need to look exactly like our outline here, just as long as we've got something that's
well.
like a flower. As long as we've got something that it's our own interpretation. If we had half a dozen pictures that looked exactly the same, it'd be very boring. It's all about our own picture.
It's the proportions to get it right, isn't it? Amazing.
It is, but I think that comes with practice.
Yes,
It's an
must be.
instinct that you learn, so it's absolutely fine. And this is good practice for that, I think.
Yeah, excellent. I'm thrilled. A wonderful scheme.
Oh, glad to hear it.
Thank you for giving your time.
Well, it's my pleasure. It really is.
It's lovely for me. I've always wanted to do something. I've never been able to. So jolly good.
Well, that's fantastic. I think as soon as you get into it, as soon as you give it a go,
Yeah.
you realize actually how fun it is and how quick you can pick it up.
And quickly pick it up. Yeah.
There's a friend of mine. He's an artist. He's a proper artist, as it were. And he said, isn't it extraordinary that as children we're also willing to draw and paint, and then we
Yeah.
become teenagers and we're very drawn into ourselves and a bit moody, and we're a bit more worried about what people think of us. And we come out of adolescence and we stop all that self-conscious rubbish and everything in most areas, but we're never again quite so happy to just draw for the sake of drawing.
Yeah, just to be free. Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's quite
Yeah.
sad. So I think that's something that we can improve on.
We can re-establish.
Exactly. Are we all ready with our outlines, or would we like a bit
I
of
think
time?
so. I'm ready.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So as I said earlier, with watercolor, we want to start with our lighter areas first. And I reckon that the lightest area within the flower shape is this sort of pale, almost a pale orangey brown color, a ring at the base of the petals here. And so we don't need to worry, for example, about these black spots of seeds or whatever, because we're going to paint those over that area, but we begin with the lightest area. So we're going to begin with that. And I think, again, we can use a color that's been ready-made for us in the palette. I think this is called light orange in your guide, but at any rate, it's this one here, just diagonal from the white. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get some of that, having first rinsed my brush nice and thoroughly.
Light orange.
And at this point, we're sort of switching, aren't we? We're not trying to get a hard outline anymore. We're trying to fill in. And so we can use a little bit more dilute approach. So I'm still tapping my brush out so it's not dripping wet. But to get a more dilute paint, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start doing the same thing, running my brush to and fro, but then I'm going to stop. I'm not going to spend too much time doing that. I'm not going to work the bristles in too much. There we go. So I've got a slightly more dilute color now. And then always with our backwards and forwards motions, I'm just going to start roughly adding this sort of band of orange, and we can see it get lighter. And if there's lots of color here, we can sort of draw it, we can pull it around and even it out. And that backwards and forwards color means that we don't get these blooms. We call it a bloom when we take the brush off the paper and there's a dark spot afterwards like that, you see. That's what happens when we've got lots of pigment, lots of water following the brush around, and we take the brush away and it all clumps together. And by keeping on using our backwards and forwards just to move that around, we can stop those from forming. We can minimize the effect they have on our picture. And maybe if I think, because I want to get it fairly faint, but if it starts getting really faint, then of course I'll just reload my brush with that same dilute paint. Maybe if I need more water, I'll put more water on. And once I've got that sort of ring, I'll just even it out a bit with a bit of backwards and forwards. Again, just pulling the color around, getting a nice even coat, something like that. And you'll note I'm being gloriously imprecise about this because, well, for two reasons. Firstly, that it's quite a sort of blurred edge on the picture itself. And also that this is watercolor and we're going to come back to paint colors over this. So we don't really need to worry about getting it spot on. We just need the band of color there, just as something to orient ourselves. And if we're all ready now, once we've finished, we're just going to have another look at our picture and start thinking about what I spoke about at the start of this session, which is all the different gradients that we can see on the petals. How do they work? Well, we've got one here where there are darker patches here and there. Darker patches generally seem to be towards the bottom of the petal, but there's more shadow on this side. These petals have a lot of shadow, again, fading out to a more dilute sort of color as we reach the tips of the petals. So we can just have a quick look at that, just get a sense for how the color isn't uniform throughout. Have a good look at that. And once we're all ready, that's something that we're going to try and recreate using the same gradient techniques that we did earlier. So I'm going to give my brush a good wash. And then I'm going to take up the same color that I did before, called Rose, I think, on your palette color guide. I'm going to do the same sort of thing. I'm going to mix a fairly strong, not too dilute color, but again, maybe not quite as thick as we used for our outline. And then once I've got that, I'm just going to start applying it where I think the color looks darkest, which is here. I'm going to go one petal at a time, I think, just to save myself too much bother. And then also here, there's a bit of dark, isn't there? Sort of running along this way. Maybe I'll draw it up a little bit like that. And then we're going to be doing just exactly the same that we did before. You know, actually, before we go on to that, I might just use the very tip of the brush just to try sort of feather that a little bit. We can use a finer brush to create more of a sort of feathered effect there. But just start pulling that dark color in. And then I'm going to dip my brush once very carefully in water, and then half on, half off. I'm going to start drawing that color out. I'm going to start pulling that color all the way around. And then once it's all wet and all active like this, we can then start shoving and pushing and pulling the color around to get these nice gradients. I think the lightest bit of this flower is at its tip and also a little bit on its right-hand side. So I'm going to try and reflect that as I move the color around the page. A bit more shade there, maybe. A bit more of a gradient there. Pull this color in as well. And then I'm just going to keep going. I'm going to go round one petal at a time, just exploring how I can start off with the darkest bit, put that color down, and then use a brush that's either been dipped in water or is loaded with nothing but water, just to pull the color around and get those gradients to make these petals pop into 3 dimensions.
That's so beautiful.
If you find, as is the case here, that maybe this flower hasn't got quite enough pigment on it, because this is a particularly dark petal, and of course, once we've done our gradient, we can just drop a bit more color in. And we drop color in by doing these very short, sharp little sort of dots. We take our paint onto our brush, and then we can sort of dot it in like this, you see, and we leave the color we deposited on the page. Then once we've dropped it in, we can get a brush and work it around and blend it in. Something I sometimes notice, we get these sort of brush strokes become visible, and that's when we're pressing a little bit too hard or we've not got enough water on our brush, and we can just use a brush loaded with water, very, very light, just to blend that in a bit, and just to get rid of that when these sort of brush marks appear, if they appear. And we can see here there were some sort of mistakes that I went over again. And sure enough, when I go over that paint now a couple of times, it gets woken up again. It joins the party, and we can pull it around and it becomes part of this sort of textured fill, and it's no longer visible as it was before. And the same is going to happen here. That's why you'll find I'm always so blissfully unconcerned when I draw a line that doesn't quite go the way I'd like it to. And here we go, it just melts away. That line just melts in. It's as though the mistake were never made. So I finished doing my petals now. I'm just going to wait so that we can all get a chance to work our way around and explore those gradients. And then we can move on to the next bit of colour. Is everyone ready to move on to the next bit of colour, or would anyone like another minute or so?
I'm fine. I've done it. Thank you.
Yes, everyone else?
Yeah.
Okay. So in that case, we're going to carry on with our big rule that we want to start with the lighter colours and then go gradually darker. And I think the next darker colour is this sort of red that we can see here. And maybe that's sort of related to the petal colour, but in shadow, but it's this fairly rich red. And we've got the dark of these little seed heads and this thing in the middle going over that. So we're going to do that little red core now. And for that, again, I think we've got the luxury of a color in our palette that'll suit our needs. So with a brush that's been nicely cleaned, again, you know the drill, wet but not dripping. I'm going to choose this one here, this red that's just neighbors with our rose color. And again, I'm going to wake it up, some backwards and forward strokes. I want to get a reasonably dilute paint, but not too dilute. And then no pressure at all, very light. I'm just going to start applying it in a wet on dry wash, just like this. And notice that I'm not worried about the middle. I'm going straight over the middle. I'm coming crashing out to the sides here, because of course the great thing is we're going to paint over this when we add our dark bits for the seed heads and the middle of the flower. So we can just come crashing right out to the edges and maybe add a little bit of a sort of feathered edge like that with the very point of our brush stabbing outwards, just to create that slightly feathered edge that we have with this band of pale orange. Maybe I'll drop a bit more paint in because it's quite a dark red. There we go. And I'm just using the very tip of the brush just to add in these little spikes, just to get that rough sort of feathered edge. Just like that. And then I'm going to shift any imbalances of color, pull it around until I'm happy with it. And then just clean my brush off again. And now that I've done that, we can have a look at our next darkest color. And I think that's these little things that I'm going to call seeds, although who knows, there might be something different. I'm not much of a botanist, I'm afraid. And I think what's interesting about these is that they, again, aren't all the same uniform color, because we can see they're three-dimensional things, and so they have a darker bit where they're facing away from the light. Let's look at this one, for example. The light's hitting it from this side. It's lightest on its right-hand side, and then it's a little darker here. And it's the same with most of the other ones. They've got a side facing the light, and then they've got a slightly darker side. So I think we can incorporate that into our drawing. I think we can use a dark blue color to, first of all, create the main blob of the seed head, and then we can add in we can drop in some further darker color to get the little shadowed part. Just before we begin, though, of course, we're going to bear in mind that this is sort of a wet on dry technique that we want to do here. We want these seed heads to have nice crisp outlines like they do here. Watercolor being very sociable, of course, if we drop paint onto paint that's already wet, it'll start spreading out, it'll start feathering, it'll start having a party. We don't really want that, which is why, to begin with, I'm not going to paint any of these seed heads on the wet red stuff, because if I do that, then they'll start blurring out, and that's not really the effect that we want to go for. So, nice clean brush in hand, wet but not dripping. I'm going to have a look for a color for the lighter bit of my seed heads. And I think that this dark blue here would be good. I think you have two colors called dark blue. This is the one next to the sienna color. Not showing up very well on my webcam. It's this one here. And so I'm just going to get a fairly strong amount of that. And then it's going to be just a matter of adding in these dots. They're not quite circular, are they? They're all sort of slightly oval. So I'm going to add some ovals accordingly. Just like that. Just do a little loop-de-looper, a single round, just like that. And I hope it goes without saying that there's no need for me to worry about exactly replicating the pattern of seed heads that we see on the picture, because if I tried to do that, I'd go mad. So we can just chuck them in where we think they'd look nice. Just get some nice patterns going. Just doing these little ovals facing in various directions. And then once this red has dried, I'm going to start putting some on top of the red as well. We're going to use the picture as a guide, of course. We're going to use the picture to see how most of them are sort of facing out from, in some way they look, most of them are sort of pointing away from the center of the flower. See how some are slightly clustered together. We use the picture to get the general principles. How are the seed heads arranged? What do they look like? What sort of patterns do they like to follow? But of course, we don't need to worry about literally following what the picture looks like. And maybe I'll steal some color from some of these darker ones just by dipping the brush in once I've done a few seed heads. That one's a bit dark, so maybe I'll just suck some color up from him and use him to paint more seed heads. And then once I've done that, maybe I'll just see, I'll have a test of whether this red middle is still wet. Maybe I'll just lightly put a finger on it. Most of those areas feel dry to the touch, and that should mean that we're good to put some paint on. Maybe some of these darker areas feel a little bit wet, so we're going to avoid those to begin with. But I think I can get my paint, and I can start doing some seed heads here. Of course, there are fewer seed heads in here, aren't there? Because they seem to come in a sort of a hemisphere outwards. And so that what appears to be the thickest part is the part sort of around the edges. So I'm going to try and reflect that by doing fewer of these heads as I get closer to the middle. And now I'm just going to wait just for a little bit, just so that those can dry. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a smaller brush. I'm using a size 4, but anything that's nice and fine like this will do. I'm going to wake it up, and then what I'm going to do is I think I might just get some fairly thick black and just add that as a shadow to some of these lighter seed heads, just to give them a bit of that three-dimensional feel. Same as before, back and forth, load the brush up, and then just using the point very sparingly. I'm just going to touch some black on, just to give a bit of shadow, just to give a bit more three-dimensional feel to some of these little seeds. And once I've done that, I'm just going to, I think I'll stay with this small brush. What I'm going to do next is this core of the plant here, which I think we can do with one of our darker brown colors. Maybe we can add in a bit of black as well. So I think I might use one of these dark browns, fairly thick. Wet on dry, because our red will have dried by now. And I'm just going to paint that rough sort of shape in the middle. Again, maybe using the point of the brush just to suggest a slightly feathered outline. And then I'm going to rinse my brush off again. And the very last thing I'm going to do before we end this session, because as I always find when teaching these things, time has flown away from me and we have about 10 minutes left. I'm just going to, again, using the tip of this small brush, very fine, no pressure at all, I'm just going to add in some of these lines here for these little stems connecting the seed heads to this core here. I'm going to want to get my black pretty thick because I want to create a very, very fine line. So quite a lot of working it into the brushes, quite a lot of really getting a lot of pigment involved. Making sure every side of the brush is loaded up, and then with the very tip of the brush, no pressure at all, just coaxing that line in. And they're all straight out, aren't they? They're all quite direct. So I'm going to copy that. Just working around as I go.
Sorry about that, anyone that can hear that.
No worries.
It's just my landline.
No worries at all. Well, now by my watch, we've got about 3 minutes left, so I'm just going to call a halt to my painting there. But as Leonardo da Vinci said, no work of art is ever finished, it's only abandoned. But we got pretty close to finishing that. And of course, you're very welcome to finish this off once our class is finished, which I think I'll do with mine. And the main,
thank you so much.
it's my pleasure. Thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did.
Oh, absolutely. Can't we hold all our things up now? Look.
Absolutely. Please do. Yes, that would be lovely. Isn't that fantastic?
That's my effort.
That's brilliant.
Lovely.
Those are all very
Oh.
nice.
Very
Excellent.
Felix,
Thank
you still can't see me, can you?
Such fun.
I'm afraid not. I've seen everyone else's though.
Yeah.
It's lovely. Oh, they're all so different. It's so interesting.
They are. I think that's what's
Yeah.
most interesting. And what's great is
Lovely.
that we're learning these skills, aren't we? That we can
Yes.
paint all sorts.
Ask about the brushes.
Yes.
You have to wash them and dry them, or
You do, yes. So again, wash and dirty, wash and clean. And then it's just a question of maybe tapping it on kitchen roll, not drying it too aggressively. Might just tap it on some kitchen roll a couple of times, and then just lay it down horizontally somewhere to dry.
and
Just
always
as-
keep the lid on the paint.
That's right, yes. So again, you can leave the paint to dry in the open air, and then we pop the lid on it. And just as long as the brushes are drying in this correct shape, that's
Yeah.
fine. They'll hold their shape.
Lovely. I look forward to seeing you next week.
Lovely.
Thank
Well, likewise, folks. Thank you very much.
you,
I hope you all
Felix.
have a lovely week. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.